Mesopotamia, 3500 BCE. A civilization appears, not gradually, not through the slow accumulation of trial and error that we expect from human development. It simply begins, fully formed, complete, as if someone pressed a start button and an entire society flickered into existence with all its systems already running. Cities with grid-patterned streets, monumental architecture, a mathematical system so sophisticated we still use it today, astronomical knowledge that shouldn't exist for another 4,000 years, and no archaeological evidence of the stages that should have come before. No primitive settlements slowly growing into towns, no crude early attempts at writing that gradually improve, no simple tools evolving into complex ones, just the sudden appearance of complexity. This is Sumer, the first civilization in the historical record, and it makes no sense. Let me be specific about what I mean. When archaeologists excavate Sumerian sites, they find the earliest layers already contain sophisticated artifacts, clay tablets with fully developed cuneiform script, not pictograms slowly evolving into writing, not simple marks that gradually become more complex, actual writing, complete grammatical systems, administrative records detailing tax collection, trade agreements, astronomical observations. From the very first layer, it's as if literacy arrived overnight, as if someone handed the Sumerians an instruction manual and said, "Here, this is how you record information," and they simply started doing it. The same pattern appears in their mathematics. The Sumerians used a sexagesimal system, base 60. This is not intuitive. Most early cultures count in base 10, using their fingers. Some use base 5 or base 20. These make biological sense. They correspond to human anatomy. But base 60? Why would anyone choose a number system based on 60 unless they had a specific reason? Unless they were encoding something? And here's what makes it stranger. We still use this system. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, which is 6 times 60. The Sumerians divided the sky into 360 degrees. They tracked the movement of planets with precision that required understanding of multi-year cycles. They knew things about celestial mechanics that should have taken centuries of observation to discover, but they appear in the historical record already knowing them. Then there's metallurgy. Bronze is an alloy, copper combined with tin in specific ratios. This is not obvious. Copper and tin don't occur together naturally. They have to be mined in different locations, transported, and combined at precise temperatures. The Sumerians had this knowledge from the beginning. Their earliest metal artifacts are already bronze. Not pure copper, which would be the expected starting point. Not the failed experiments you'd expect from people figuring out metallurgy through trial and error. Sophisticated bronze work. From layer 1, as if they inherited the knowledge from someone else. But inherited from whom? This is where the story becomes uncomfortable for conventional archaeology, because the Sumerians themselves gave us an answer. They wrote it down in detail on thousands of clay tablets. They said their knowledge came from the Apkallu, the 7 sages, beings who emerged from the sea before the Great Flood and taught humanity the arts of civilization, writing, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, architecture, law. All of it, they said, was taught, not discovered, not developed, taught by beings who came before. Now, conventional archaeology dismisses this as mythology, as the typical human tendency to attribute knowledge to gods or supernatural beings. And perhaps that's correct. Perhaps the Sumerians invented everything themselves and later mythologized the process. But then we have to explain the absence of development. We have to explain why there are no earlier, simpler versions. We have to explain the sudden appearance of complexity, and we have to explain the king list. The Sumerian king list is one of the most baffling documents in archaeology. It's a chronological list of kings who ruled Sumer, compiled around 2100 BCE, but describing events going back much earlier. It lists dynasties, their rulers, and the length of their reigns. For the recent kings, the historical ones we can verify through other sources, the numbers are reasonable. A king rules for 20 years, 30 years, occasionally 40 or 50. But as the list goes backward in time, the numbers become impossible. Before the flood, it says, there were 8 kings, and their reigns lasted tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. Alalga ruled for 36,000 years. Dumuzid ruled for 36,000 years. In Men, Lu Anna ruled for 43,200 years. 8 kings, total reign, 241,200 years. Then the flood came. It says, and when kingship descended again, the reign lengths gradually decreased, but were still impossibly long. Now, we could dismiss these as exaggerations, as mythological inflation of historical figures. But notice something. The numbers aren't random. They follow a pattern. 28,800 is 60x, 60x 8. 36,000 is 60x, 60x 10. 43,200 is 60x, 60x 12. They're using the sexagesimal system. They're encoding something in multiples of 60. And 43,200 is particularly significant. It appears constantly in ancient texts worldwide. The Rig Veda describes 432,000 years as the length of the Kali Yuga. Norse mythology speaks of 432,000 warriors emerging from Valhalla. This number, 432, resonates through ancient knowledge systems like a frequency. Some researchers believe it's related to the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 25,920 years to complete. If you divide that by 60, you get 432. The Sumerians seem to have been encoding cosmic cycles into their king list, not recording literal human lifespans, but preserving astronomical knowledge in numerical form, which means they understood precession. They were tracking celestial mechanics that require centuries of continuous observation to detect, but they appear in the historical record already knowing it. And then there's this line, this single phrase that appears repeatedly in Sumerian texts. After the flood had swept over, when kingship descended from heaven, after the flood. They're dividing history into 2 periods, before the flood and after. Before the catastrophe and after the catastrophe. The implication is clear. There was something before, some prior civilization, some prior age of kings and knowledge, and then water swept it away. And what survived? What continued? The knowledge, preserved by the 7 sages, passed down, taught to the survivors. This is what the Sumerians themselves tell us. Now, before we go further, I want to pause here, because if you're settling in to listen to this, if you're lying down, if maybe it's late where you are, and you're letting this story carry you towards sleep, I need to ask you something. Leave a comment. Tell me where you are. Tell me what time it is as you're watching this. I mean this genuinely. I read every comment. And there's something profound, something almost sacred about seeing Auckland's early morning and Mumbai's afternoon and Sao Paulo's midnight all appearing in the same thread. We're scattered across this planet, separated by oceans and time zones. But right now, in this moment, we're all here. We're all asking the same question. Where did it come from? This knowledge that appears fully formed, this civilization that seems to have no childhood. So tell me, Tell me where you are as you're wondering this. Because this question, this mystery, it connects us across distance in a way that the ancient Sumerians would have understood. They tracked the stars, after all. They knew that, despite our separation, we're all looking at the same sky. Drop a comment. Your location, your time. Let's see how many of us are awake right now, across this turning planet, thinking about what came before. Because here's what makes this urgent. Sumer is not unique. The pattern of sudden appearance, of knowledge without precedent, appears globally, in multiple locations, in civilizations that supposedly had no contact with each other, and they all tell the same story. They all say there was something before, some prior age, some lost world that was destroyed by catastrophe. And they all say knowledge survived. Knowledge was passed down. Knowledge was taught by survivors to those who came after. The Egyptians said their civilization was founded by the Neteru, divine beings who ruled in a golden age before the flood. The Maya spoke of previous worlds, previous humanities that were destroyed and had to begin again. The Hopi speak of 4 previous worlds, each ending in catastrophe, with a small group of people surviving to carry knowledge into the next. Hindu texts describe the cycle of yugas, vast ages of time, with humanity rising and falling through each cycle. The Greeks told of Atlantis, an advanced civilization that sank beneath the waves in a single day and night. Different cultures, different languages, different continents, same story. And here's what archaeology is beginning to confirm. There was a catastrophe, a real one, approximately 12,800 years ago, the Younger Dryas event. A sudden, dramatic climate shift that reversed the warming trend at the end of the Ice Age. Temperatures plummeted, ice sheets advanced again, megafauna went extinct, human populations crashed. And here's the crucial detail. It happened fast. Within a decade, possibly within years, the global climate system reorganized. The evidence is in ice cores, in sediment layers, in the fossil record. Something happened. Something that disrupted human civilization on a global scale. And when it was over, when the survivors emerged, they carried knowledge with them. Fragments of what had been known before. Stories about the world that was lost. And they encoded those stories in myths, in monuments, in numerical systems that would survive even if the context was forgotten. The Sumerians inherited this knowledge. They didn't invent it. They preserved it. And what they preserved suggests that before the catastrophe, there was complexity, there was advancement, there was civilization, but not our civilization, not the one we know from history, a previous iteration. This is where conventional thinking breaks down, because we're taught to think of human history as linear, as a progression from primitive to advanced, from hunter-gatherers to farmers to city builders. We're taught that civilization began in Mesopotamia around 3,500 BCE, in Egypt shortly after, in the Indus Valley in China within the next 1,000 years. We're taught that everything before that was prehistory, small bands of humans, living simply, leaving no permanent mark. But what if that's wrong? What if civilization is not a line, but a cycle? What if humanity has risen before, achieved complexity before, and then collapsed? What if we're not the first? What if we're not even the second or third? What if we're the 7th? Because that's what the ancient texts say. Across cultures, across continents, they speak of 7 ages, 7 worlds, 7 humanities. The Hopi speak of 4 previous worlds and say we're in the 5th, but their prophecies speak of 2 more to come, 7 total. Hindu cosmology describes 7 stages of human consciousness, each one more refined than the last. Theosophy, drawing on ancient mystery schools, describes the same pattern. 7 cycles, with humanity currently in the 5th, approaching the transition to the 6th. Even the Bible, though it's been edited and reinterpreted countless times, preserves traces of this. 7 days of creation, 7 seals, 7 churches, 7 as the number of completion. Why 7? Is it arbitrary? Is it symbolic? Or is it literal? Is it a count? 7 iterations, 7 attempts, 7 cycles of rise and fall. And we, with our smartphones and satellites and nuclear weapons, we are the 7th. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like mythology. This sounds like mysticism, not science. And you're right to be skeptical. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But here's what we need to understand. The line between mythology and history is not as clear as we pretend it is. Mythology is how literate cultures encoded knowledge. It's how they preserved information across generations without writing. If you want to remember something for 1,000 years, you don't write it in prose. Prose can be forgotten, miscopied, lost. You encode it in a story. You make it memorable. You attach it to emotions, to images, to rhythms that stick in the mind. You make it a myth. And the myths, when you examine them closely, when you strip away the supernatural elements and look at what they're describing, they're consistent. Globally consistent. They describe advanced civilizations. They describe catastrophic floods. They describe survivors teaching the next generation. They describe cycles of time, vast ages, worlds that came before. And now, we're beginning to find physical evidence that supports these stories. Underwater archaeology has discovered ruins in locations that shouldn't have ruins. Structures on coastlines that were above water 12,000 years ago but are submerged now. Off the coast of India, near Dwarka, there are stone structures 40 meters underwater. Walls, foundations, geometric patterns. Dating suggests they're at least 9,000 years old, possibly older. Off the coast of Japan, near Waianae, there's a massive stone structure that looks artificial. Terraces, steps, flat platforms. Some geologists say it's natural. Others insist it's carved. Off the coast of Cuba, sonar has detected stone structures at a depth that suggests they're over 10,000 years old. These are not anomalies. These are data points, and they all point in the same direction. There was human activity, human construction, human civilization in places that are now underwater, which means it happened before the sea level rise, before the ice melted, before the Younger Dryas event ended and the oceans rose by 120 meters, before the flood. And then there are the maps. The Piri-Reis map, created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral. It shows the coast of South America with remarkable accuracy, but it also shows something impossible. It shows the coastline of Antarctica, without ice. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, and it's been covered in ice for millions of years, except it hasn't. Geological surveys have shown that parts of the Antarctic coast were ice-free approximately 6,000 years ago, possibly earlier. The Piri-Reis map, according to notes written on the map itself, was compiled from older sources, from ancient maps, from sources that no longer exist. Someone mapped Antarctica when it was ice-free, and that knowledge, that cartographic information, was preserved and passed down until it appeared on a Turkish map in the 16th century. The Orientisfine map from 1531 shows the same thing. Antarctica, with interior rivers, with mountain ranges. Details that weren't confirmed until satellite radar imaging in the 1950s. Someone knew. Someone mapped it, long before our civilization developed the technology to do so. And then there are the artifacts that shouldn't exist. The Antikythera mechanism, a Greek device from approximately 100 BCE, a complex assembly of bronze gears, designed to calculate astronomical positions. It predicts eclipses. It tracks the movement of planets. It's a computer. An analog computer, yes, but a computer nonetheless. Nothing this sophisticated appears again in the historical record until the 14th century. We went backward. We lost the knowledge. And then we had to rediscover it. The Baghdad battery. Clay jars from 250 BCE containing copper cylinders and iron rods. When filled with acidic liquid, they generate electrical current. Were the Parthians doing electroplating? Were they creating batteries? We don't know. We only know the artifacts exist, and they suggest knowledge that shouldn't exist yet. Puma Punku in Bolivia. Stone blocks cut with machine precision. H-shaped blocks that interlock perfectly. Drill holes that are perfectly circular and uniform in depth. The precision is not just impressive for ancient stonework. It would be impressive for modern stonework. The tolerances are within millimeters across massive blocks weighing tons. Who cut these? With what tools? And why does the traditional timeline place this site at only 1500 years old when the weathering and astronomical alignments suggest it might be much older? These are not conspiracy theories. These are physical objects, archaeological sites, documents and maps and artifacts that exist in museums and academic collections. They're not hidden. They're not secret. They're just inconvenient. Inconvenient for a historical model that assumes linear progress, that assumes we're the most advanced humans who have ever lived, that assumes everything before us was necessarily more primitive. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the Sumerians really did inherit their knowledge? What if the sudden appearance of civilization isn't a mystery but a memory? What if we're not the beginning but the continuation? The question is not whether advanced knowledge existed in the past. The evidence suggests it did. The question is, how many times has this happened before? How many previous iterations have risen and fallen, leaving only fragments behind? How many times has humanity climbed toward complexity, achieved understanding, and then collapsed back to basics? And are we climbing for the first time? Or are we climbing again? The Sumerians said they were not. The Egyptians said knowledge came from before. The Maya said they were inheriting from previous worlds. What if they were telling the truth? What if civilization doesn't begin? It resumes. And if that's true, if we're part of a cycle, then the next question is obvious. Where are we in that cycle? Are we in the beginning, full of potential, just starting to build? Or are we in the end, repeating the same mistakes, approaching the same catastrophe that has swept away every previous iteration? The ancient texts give us a framework. They describe the pattern. They tell us how the cycle works. And that pattern is what we need to examine next. Because if we can see the pattern, if we can understand how this has happened before, then maybe this time we can choose differently. Maybe this time the seventh world can learn from the previous six. Maybe this time we can break the cycle. But first, we need to see it clearly. We need to look at the global evidence. We need to connect the fragments. We need to reconstruct the library that was scattered across continents and millennia. We need to see the pattern. And the pattern is what comes next. There's a library, not a building. Not a collection of books in one location. A library scattered across the entire planet. Fragments preserved in myths, encoded in monuments, buried underwater, carved into stone in languages we've forgotten. Imagine a book torn into pieces, each piece thrown in a different direction. Some landing in deserts where they're preserved by dryness. Some falling into oceans where they're hidden by depth. Some burned, some buried. Some passed hand to hand until the words are worn smooth but the shape remains. This is the situation we're in. We have pieces, and if we're careful, if we're willing to look at what the pieces actually say rather than what we expect them to say, we can begin to reconstruct what the book contained. And what it contained is a warning, a pattern, a cycle, a description of what has happened before and what will happen again. Unless we learn to read it, let me show you what I mean. We're going to examine the fragments, not individually, as isolated curiosities, but as pieces of a single narrative. A narrative that appears in over 500 cultures worldwide. Cultures separated by oceans, by mountains, by thousands of years of independent development. And yet they tell the same story. The story of the flood. Now you've heard of Noah's flood. It's in the Bible, it's in the Quran, it's one of the most famous stories in Western civilization. But what you might not know is that it's not originally a Hebrew story. The earliest written version comes from Sumer. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which dates to approximately 2100 BCE but describes events from much earlier, contains a detailed flood narrative. Amun named Utnapishtim is warned by a god that a flood is coming. He's told to build a boat, to take his family, craftsmen, animals, to seal the boat with bitumen. The flood comes. It lasts for 7 days and nights. The waters cover everything. All of humanity is destroyed except those on the boat. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. Utnapishtim sends out birds to test whether the water has receded. First a dove, which returns, then a swallow, which returns, finally a raven, which doesn't return, indicating that land has appeared. If this sounds familiar, it should. It's nearly identical to the Noah narrative that appears in Genesis, which was written roughly 1500 years later. The Hebrews didn't invent this story. They inherited it from the Babylonians, who inherited it from the Sumerians. But here's what makes it significant. The Sumerians weren't the only ones telling this story. In India, the Matsya Purana describes a great flood. A man named Manu is warned by a fish that a deluge is coming. He builds a boat. He takes seeds of all plants and pairs of all animals. The flood comes and destroys all life except what's on the boat. In Greece, the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha describes Zeus sending a flood to destroy humanity. Deucalion builds an ark and survives with his wife. They land on Mount Parnassus. They repopulate the earth. In Mesoamerica, the Aztec creation myths describe for previous worlds, each destroyed by catastrophe. The fourth world was destroyed by water. Talaka, the rain god, caused a flood that lasted 52 years. A couple survived by hiding in a hollow tree. The Maya Popol Vuh describes a great flood sent by the heart of sky to destroy a failed creation. The people were turned to stone and a new humanity had to be created. In North America, the Hopi tell of a previous world destroyed by flood. People survived by climbing into hollow reeds and floating until the waters receded. The Ojibwe describe a great flood sent by the Creator. Nanaba's survives by floating on a log with various animals. He sends out a muskrat to dive down and retrieve earth from below the waters, which he uses to recreate the land. In South America, the Inca told of a flood called Pachacuti. Waters rose from both the ocean and the sky. Only a few people survived on the peaks of the highest mountains. In Australia, Aboriginal traditions describe a time when the sea level was much lower, when you could walk to what are now islands. Then the waters rose and swallowed the land. These stories include specific geographic details that match the coastline from 10,000 years ago. I could continue. There are flood stories in Polynesia, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Siberia. Over 500 distinct cultural traditions, spread across every inhabited continent. And they're not vague, they're specific. They describe water rising. They describe boats or rafts or floating devices. They describe a small group of survivors. They describe animals being saved. They describe the water receding and landing on a mountain or high ground. They describe the world before as being inhabited, populated, often described as corrupt or fallen. And they describe the world after as requiring a new beginning, a restart, a fresh attempt. Now, the conventional explanation for this is that floods are common. Every culture experiences flooding. Rivers overflow, storms cause inundation. These events get mythologized. And yes, local floods happen. Of course they do. But these stories aren't describing local floods. They're describing a global catastrophe. They're describing the destruction of the entire known world, and they contain details that are too specific, too consistent across cultures that had no contact with each other. Let me give you an example. Multiple flood myths describe the waters coming not just from rain but from below. The fountains of the deep were broken up, as Genesis puts it. The Sumerian version describes the same thing. Waters erupting from beneath the earth. This is not how normal flooding works. Rain falls, rivers overflow, that's familiar. But water erupting from below? That's a specific, unusual detail. And yet it appears in geographically separated traditions. Why? Unless they're all describing the same event. an event that involved not just rain, but some kind of seismic activity, earthquakes, tsunamis, a disruption of the Earth's crust that caused water to surge upward. And then there's the timeline. Most of these flood myths place the event at a specific time in the past, not recent history, not within living memory, but at a boundary point, a moment when the old world ended and the new world began. Hindu chronology places the flood at the transition between the previous yuga and the current one, approximately 12,000 years ago by some calculations. Aboriginal Australian stories describe the flooding of the land bridge to Tasmania and the drowning of coastal areas. Geological evidence confirms this happened between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, as the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose. The timing is consistent, and it's consistent with something else, with physical evidence, because there was a flood, a real one, not a single event that covered the entire planet in water, like the literal interpretation of Noah's flood, but a global rise in sea levels that happened relatively quickly in geological terms and would have been catastrophic for any coastal populations. At the peak of the last ice age, approximately 20,000 years ago, sea levels were 120 meters lower than they are today. That's for 100 feet. The coastlines were completely different. What are now continental shelves were dry and vast areas of habitable terrain, and people lived there. Of course they did. Coastlines are prime real estate. Access to marine resources, to trade routes, to diverse ecosystems. If population density on Ice Age coastlines was anything like historical coastal population density, then the majority of the human population was living in areas that are now underwater. Then the ice melted, not slowly, not gradually in a way that people could easily adapt to. It melted in pulses, sudden releases of glacial meltwater that caused sea level to jump by meters in a matter of years. The Younger Dryas event, which we mentioned, was one of these pulses. When that 1,000-year cold period ended around 11,600 years ago, the warming resumed. Ice sheets collapsed. Meltwater poured into the oceans. There's evidence of catastrophic melt events. Lake Agassiz in North America, a massive glacial lake, broke through its ice dam and drained into the ocean, billions of tons of fresh water releasing in a geologically instant time frame. This would have caused sea level spikes, sudden inundations, coastal areas flooded in days or weeks. If you were living on the coast, you would have experienced this as a flood. A catastrophic, world-ending flood, and the survivors would have told stories. Stories that would be passed down, generation after generation, about the time the waters rose and swallowed the world. So the flood myths are not pure invention. They're not metaphor. They're memory, distorted memory. Yes, mythologized, certainly, but memory nonetheless. Memory of a real event that affected populations globally. An event that would have destroyed coastal settlements, forced mass migrations, caused the collapse of whatever social structures existed at the time. And here's the crucial point: if there were settlements, if there were populations, if there was any level of social complexity along those Ice Age coastlines, we can't see it, because it's underwater. Under 120 meters of water, under thousands of years of marine sediment, in areas we have barely begun to explore. We've surveyed less than 1% of the ocean floor. Less than 1%. The evidence is there, we just haven't found it yet, but we have found some of it. And what we've found is remarkable. Off the coast of India, near the city of Warka, divers have discovered stone structures underwater. Walls running for hundreds of meters, geometric patterns, artifacts including pottery and anchors. The area was above water during the Ice Age. It was flooded when sea levels rose, which means these structures are at least 9,000 years old, possibly much older. Traditional history says civilization in India began around 2500 BCE with the Indus Valley Civilization. But here's evidence of construction 500 years earlier, underwater, preserved by the flood, off the coast of Japan, near Waianae Island. There's a formation that has sparked decades of debate. It looks like a stepped pyramid. Flat terraces, right angles, channels carved in straight lines. Posts that appear deliberately placed. Some geologists insist it's natural. Rock can fracture in geometric patterns under certain conditions. But other geologists disagree. They point to features that seem impossible to explain through natural processes, tool marks, modifications, intentional shaping. Masaaki Kimura, a marine geologist who has studied the site for over 20 years, believes it's artificial. A monument carved from bedrock, dating to at least 10,000 years ago based on when the site was above water. If he's right, it's older than the pyramids by 5,000 years. Older than Sumer. Older than any civilization in the conventional timeline. In 2001, off the coast of Cuba, a research team using sonar discovered structures at a depth of 700 meters. Not just rocks. Structures. Geometric patterns. What appear to be roads, pyramids, arranged in an urban layout. The depth is problematic. For the site to have been above water, sea levels would need to have been 700 meters lower. That doesn't match the Ice Age timeline. Unless the land subsided. Unless there was tectonic activity that dropped the entire area after it was built. The Cuban government initially showed interest, then suddenly shut down further investigation. The site has not been explored since. We don't know what's down there, but the sonar images suggest something that shouldn't exist. These underwater sites are data points. They're not conclusive on their own. Each one can be debated, explained away, dismissed as natural formation or misinterpretation. But together, they form a pattern. They suggest that there was human activity along the Ice Age coastlines. That there were constructions. That when the waters rose, these sites were submerged and preserved. And if that's true, if there was complexity along those coastlines, then the flood myths are not describing a punishment from the gods. They're describing a real catastrophe, a climate event that destroyed the world as those people knew it. The survivors moved inland. They carried their knowledge with them, fragmented and traumatized. They told stories about what was lost, about the cities beneath the waves, about the wisdom that was drowned. And those stories became myths. But the library contains more than flood stories. It contains something else, something that appears across cultures with the same consistency. Maps, ancient maps showing knowledge that shouldn't exist. The Piri-Reis map, which we mentioned earlier, is not alone. Yorantisphina-Eus map from 1531 shows Antarctica in remarkable detail, not as a blank landmass, but with interior features, rivers, mountain ranges, topographic detail. This information wouldn't be available to European cartographers until the 20th century, until ground-penetrating radar could see through the ice. And yet there it is, on a map from 1531. The cartographer couldn't have surveyed Antarctica himself. It was surrounded by ice. It was inaccessible. He was copying from older sources. The map itself indicates this. It references ancient texts, older maps, information preserved from classical antiquity. Someone knew. Someone mapped Antarctica when it was ice-free, or when the ice was minimal enough to reveal the topography, and that knowledge was preserved, passed down, copied from map to map, until it appeared in the 16th century, where we could find it and wonder how it was possible. The Zano map from 1380 shows Greenland without ice. It shows coastal details that were only confirmed by modern surveys. The Haji Ahmad map from 1559 shows a land bridge between Siberia and Alaska. This bridge existed during the Ice Age. It's called Beringia. It was flooded around 10,000 years ago when sea levels rose. How did a 16th-century Turkish cartographer know about a land bridge that had been underwater for over 10 years? He was copying from older sources, sources that predated the flood. Conventional historians struggle with these maps. They're forced to explain them as coincidence, as lucky guesses, as misinterpretations of more recent geography. But the details are too specific. The accuracy is too high. These maps are evidence. Evidence that someone, at some point in the distant past, had the capability to survey and map the Earth at a level of accuracy that we associate with modern technology. And that knowledge survived, not completely, not perfectly, but in fragments, copied and recopied, until some of it reached the present day, where we could recognize it for what it was, a memory. encoded in cartography, passed down through the library of echoes. And then there are the artifacts. Physical objects that exist in museums, that can be examined, tested, analyzed. Objects that, according to the conventional timeline, shouldn't exist. The Antikythera mechanism was discovered in 1901 in a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera. It's dated to approximately 100 BCE. For decades, no one could figure out what it was. It was clearly complex. It had gears, dozens of them, in an intricate assembly. It wasn't until the 1970s, when X-ray analysis revealed the internal structure, that researchers understood. It was a calculator, an astronomical calculator designed to predict the positions of celestial bodies. It could calculate the position of the sun and moon. It could predict eclipses. It tracked the cycles of the known planets. It even accounted for the irregularities in the moon's orbit using a pin minus and minus slot device that simulates CPI cyclic motion. This is sophisticated mechanical engineering. Differential gears, which weren't supposed to be reinvented until the 1500s. Precision manufacturing that wouldn't be matched until the development of clockwork. And it existed in 100 BCE. Then it was lost. The knowledge of how to build such devices disappeared. For over 1,000 years, nothing remotely comparable was created. Then, slowly, clockmakers in medieval Europe began to rediscover the principles. By the 14th century, they were building astronomical clocks that approached the complexity of the Antikythera mechanism. But they weren't inventing, they were reinventing. They were climbing back to a level of knowledge that had existed before and been lost. The Baghdad Battery is a series of clay jars found in Iraq, dating to approximately 250 BCE. Each jar contains a copper cylinder with an iron rod suspended inside. When filled with an acidic liquid like vinegar or wine, they produce a small electrical current, about half a volt. Why would ancient Parthians build batteries? One theory is electroplating, coating objects with a thin layer of gold or silver using electrical current. There's evidence this was done, objects that show signs of electroplating, even though conventional history says electricity wasn't harnessed until the 1700s. Maybe it wasn't harnessed. Maybe it was re-harnessed. Maybe the knowledge existed before and was forgotten. And then there are the stones. Pumapunku, in Bolivia, high in the Andes, contains some of the most precisely cut stone blocks ever found. H-shaped blocks weighing tons, cut with perfect right angles, with surfaces flat to within millimeters. Drill holes that are perfectly circular, perfectly uniform in depth and diameter. This is not Bronze-Age precision. This is industrial precision. The site is traditionally dated to around 536 CE, but the weathering suggests it's much older. The astronomical alignments don't match 536 CE. They match a date approximately 15,000 years ago. If that's accurate, these stones were cut before civilization supposedly existed, before metalworking, before agriculture. Cut with what? By whom? The conventional answer is that the dating must be wrong. That ancient people used simple tools and enormous patience to achieve this precision. But when modern stonemasons attempt to replicate these cuts using bronze tools, using stone hammers, using any technology that would have been available at the time, they can't match the precision. They can cut stone, but not like this. Something is missing from our understanding, either about the timeline or about the capabilities. Sacsayhuaman, near Cuzco, in Peru, has walls made of stones weighing up to 200 tons, fitted together without mortar so precisely that you cannot slide a piece of paper between them. Polygonal blocks, irregular shapes, each one unique, each one fitting perfectly with its neighbors. This is not stacking rectangular blocks. This is three-dimensional puzzle assembly at a massive scale. The Inca, who were present when the Spanish arrived, said they didn't build it. They said it was built by an earlier people, before them. The Spanish recorded this. They wrote that the Inca claimed these walls were ancient even to them. If the Inca didn't build it, who did? Someone who had capabilities we struggle to explain. Someone who had time and resources and knowledge that allowed for this level of engineering. These artifacts, these sites, They're pieces of the library, physical pieces, not stories that can be dismissed as myth, not texts that can be explained as exaggeration, physical objects, stone and metal and gears in precision, evidence that there was knowledge, that there were capabilities, that at various points in the past, people knew how to do things that were later forgotten. And when we arrange these pieces, when we look at them together rather than separately, a pattern emerges, not a pattern of steady progress, not a line from primitive to advanced, a pattern of cycles, of rising and falling, of knowledge gained and knowledge lost, of libraries scattered, of information preserved in fragments, of each generation inheriting pieces but not the whole. And the most important piece of the library, the piece that ties everything together, the framework, the model, the understanding of time itself, because every ancient culture that preserved this knowledge also preserved a specific model of how time works, not as a line, as a circle, not as progress, as a cycle. And that cycle has specific measurements, specific durations, specific markers. The precession of the equinoxes, 25,920 years. This is the cosmic clock, the great year, the cycle that every advanced ancient civilization racked and encoded into their monuments and their myths. Why? Because this cycle marks the turning, the moment when one age ends and another begins. And according to this model, we're approaching the turning point again. The seventh world is nearing its transition. And the question is whether we'll remember, whether we'll recognize the pattern, whether we'll preserve the knowledge this time, or whether we'll repeat the cycle again, losing what we've gained, scattering the library once more. Because the library tells us something crucial. It tells us this has happened before, multiple times, and it tells us what happens next. There's a number that appears everywhere in ancient knowledge systems, not randomly, not as coincidence, deliberately encoded, repeated with a frequency that demands explanation. Let me show you where it appears. The Rig Veda, composed in India at least 500 years ago but describing knowledge claimed to be far older, states that the Kali Yuga, the current age of darkness, lasts for 432 years. The preceding age, the Dva Para Yuga, lasts for 864, which is exactly double. 432 times second, the age before that, the Treta Yuga, lasts 1,296,000 years. That's 432 times third. And the Golden Age, the Satya Yuga, lasts 1,728,000 years. That's 432 times fourth. The entire cycle, called a Mahayuga, totals 4,320,000 years. 432 again. In Norse mythology, the prose Edda describes 432,000 warriors emerging from Valhalla to fight at Ragnarok, the end of the world. Why that specific number? Why not 500,000, or 1,000,000, or simply countless? Because the number itself carries meaning. It's encoding something. The Sumerian king list, which we discussed, contains those impossibly long reign lengths, 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. 43,200 is 432 times 100. The Sumerians were using base 60, so these numbers make sense in their system. But the fact that they reduced to 432 is not accidental. They're encoding the same knowledge, the same cycle. In ancient Babylon, the priest Berossus wrote a history of the world that survives only in fragments quoted by later historians. He describes 432,000 years from the descent of kingship to the flood. There it is again. That same number. The Great Pyramid of Giza has a base perimeter of 1760 cubits. Its height is 280 cubits. If you calculate the relationship between these measurements, you get ratios that encode mathematical constants. Pi, phi. The relationship between the circumference of a circle and its radius. But you also get 432nd, the pyramid's proportions, when analyzed in certain ways, consistently return to this number, as if the builders were deliberately encoding it into the structure. In music, 432 Hz is claimed by some researchers to be a natural frequency. The frequency of the universe. When instruments are tuned to A432 Hz instead of the modern standard of A440 Hz, the music is said to resonate more harmoniously with natural patterns. This is debated. There's no scientific consensus on whether 432 Hz has special properties. But the fact that musicians and acousticians keep returning to this number, the fact that it keeps appearing in discussions of harmonic resonance, suggests that at minimum, there's something about 432 that human perception finds significant. So what is 432? Why does this number appear in cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years? The answer lies in the precession of the equinoxes. Imagine you're standing on Earth, watching the stars. Over the course of a night, they appear to rotate around a central point. That's the celestial pole, the point directly above Earth's axis of rotation. Currently, the North Star, Polaris, is very close to the celestial North Pole. But it hasn't always been there, and it won't always be there, because Earth's axis wobbles. It's a very slow wobble. It takes approximately 920 years to complete one full cycle. This is called the precession of the equinoxes. As the axis wobbles, the celestial poles move, different stars become the North Star. The position of the sunrise on the equinox shifts against the background of the zodiacal constellations. Ancient astronomers noticed this. They tracked it. They measured it with remarkable precision. And they encoded the cycle into their monuments, their calendars, their myths. Now, divide 25,920 by 60th, you get 432. The precession cycle, measured in the 6 ages IML system that the Sumerians used, reduces to 432nd. This is not coincidence. This is deliberate encoding. The ancient astronomers were preserving information about the cosmic cycle in numerical form. They were ensuring that even if the astronomical knowledge was lost, even if people forgot how to observe and calculate, the numbers would survive. And the numbers do tell you something crucial. They tell you that time is not linear. They tell you that the cosmos operates in cycles, that what has been will be again. And specifically, they tell you that these cycles have meaning, that they mark transitions, that they correspond to changes in human consciousness, in civilization, in the conditions of life on Earth. This is where we need to shift our thinking. In the modern Western worldview, time is a line. It starts at a beginning and proceeds toward an end. History is progress. Each generation builds on the last. We're moving forward, always forward, toward greater complexity and understanding. This is a recent idea. It comes from the Enlightenment, from the Industrial Revolution, from the last few centuries of rapid technological change. But it's not how most of human history has understood time. The ancient view, the view that dominated human thinking for thousands of years across nearly every culture, is that time is a circle. Not literally. Not in the sense that the exact same events repeat, but in the sense that there are patterns, cycles, seasons operating on scales far larger than human lifetimes. Just as the year has seasons, spring to summer to autumn to winter and back to spring, so does cosmic time have seasons, ages, each with its own characteristics. And just as winter is followed by spring, so too is decline followed by renewal, collapse followed by rebirth. This is the framework within which the ancient world understood history, and this framework describes 7 cycles, 7 ages, 7 turnings of the wheel. The clearest description of this comes from Hindu cosmology, preserved in the Vedas and the Puranas. The model describes 7 great cycles, 7 stages of human consciousness. The first cycle, the Polarian, existed in a purely ethereal state, not physical beings as we understand them. The second cycle, the Hyperborean, began to take physical form, but still existed in a higher vibrational state. The third cycle, the Lemurian, became fully physical. They inhabited a great continent in what is now the Pacific Ocean. Their civilization was destroyed by fire, by volcanic cataclysm. The fourth Atlantean rose to great heights of technological and psychic development. They inhabited a continent in the Atlantic Ocean. Their civilization was destroyed by water, by the flood we've been discussing. The fifth humanity, the current cycle, is the one we know. We rose from the survivors of the previous age. We're spread across the globe, and we were approaching the end of our cycle. The sixth and seventh cycles have not yet fully manifested. They represent future stages of human evolution, stages of higher consciousness, of reintegration with the spiritual dimensions. Now, before you dismiss this as mysticism, as unscientific speculation, consider what this model is actually describing. It's describing a pattern of rise and fall, of civilizations reaching complexity and then collapsing, of knowledge being gained, lost, and slowly recovered. It's describing exactly what the archaeological record shows us, if we're willing to look at it without the assumption of linear progress. And it's describing 7 iterations, 7 attempts, 7 cycles of human civilization, each building on the fragments of what came before. We are the 5th. We're in the middle of this sequence, which means there were 3 before us that rose and fell completely, and there are 2 more to come after us. The Hopi people of North America tell a similar story. They speak of 4 previous worlds, each destroyed by different means. The first world was destroyed by fire, the second by ice, the third by water, the fourth by flood. We're in the 5th world now, they say, and the prophecies speak of a choice. A moment when humanity must decide whether to continue in the pattern of destruction or to evolve into a 6th world of harmony, for previous worlds destroyed. A 5th world in crisis, a potential 6th world of transformation. Count them. That's 6, with the implicit 7th being the completion, the return to unity. 7 turnings. The Maya had a similar model, though structured differently. They spoke of 5 suns, 5 ages, each ending in catastrophe. The first sun ended in jaguars devouring humanity, the second in hurricanes, the third in rains of fire, the fourth in floods. We're in the 5th sun, and according to their calendar, we're approaching a transition point. Not the end of the world, as 2012 doomsday predictions claimed, but the end of a cycle, a turning point. Even Western tradition preserves traces of this. The Book of Revelation speaks of 7 churches, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 as the number of completion, of the full cycle. The concept of the Sabbath, the 7th day of rest, reflects this: 6 days of labor, 1 day of completion and renewal. Creation itself is described in 7 days, 6 days of making, 1 day of being. The pattern is consistent: 6 active phases and a 7th that represents completion, transformation, transcendence. And this pattern operates at multiple scales. There are daily cycles, the 24 minus our rotation of Earth. There are yearly cycles, the 365 minus day orbit around the sun. There are human lifetime cycles, birth, growth, maturity, decline, death. And there are cosmic cycles, the 25,920 minus year precession of the equinoxes. Each cycle nested within larger cycles, all following the same pattern: growth, peak, decline, collapse, renewal. The ancient astronomers understood this. They saw that the same patterns that govern the day and the year also govern vast spans of time, and they encoded this understanding into their monuments, their myths, their numerical systems. They were trying to tell us something. Across thousands of years, across the gulf of lost languages and dead civilizations, they were sending a message. This has happened before. This will happen again. Unless you learn to recognize the pattern, the mystery schools, the esoteric traditions, the secret societies that have preserved ancient knowledge, they understood this. The Egyptian priesthood, who initiated students into the mysteries at temples like Karnak and Ur, were teaching this model. The universe is cycles within cycles, human consciousness as evolving through stages, death and rebirth as the fundamental pattern. The Eleusinian mysteries in Greece, celebrated for nearly 2,000 years, were initiating people into the same understanding. The descent of Persephone into the underworld and her return, each spring, was not just a story about seasons. It was a teaching about cycles of consciousness, about the necessity of descent before transformation can occur. The Pythagorean schools in ancient Greece taught that number was the fundamental reality, that the cosmos was structured according to mathematical relationships, that these relationships could be understood through harmonic ratios, through geometry, through the study of cycles. And always, the number 7 appeared. 7 planets visible to the naked eye. 7 notes in the musical scale. 7 stages of initiation. These schools were not inventing these concepts. They were preserving them, passing them down from earlier sources, from the knowledge that survived previous cycles, because that's the purpose of mystery schools. That's why they're called mysteries. Why the knowledge was restricted, taught only to initiates, never written down in plain language. Not because the priests wanted to hoard power, but because the knowledge needed to survive. When a civilization collapses, when catastrophe strikes, institutions fail. Libraries burn, cities are abandoned. The general population scatters and focuses on survival. But if knowledge is encoded in rituals, in symbols, in initiatory experiences that create powerful memories, it has a chance of being preserved. A small group of initiates, committed to the teaching, can carry it through the collapse and pass it to the next generation. This is how knowledge survives the gaps, how it bridges the dark ages, how it reappears in new civilizations, seemingly from nowhere. It's not new. It's preserved, carried forward by the guardians, and the knowledge they were preserving was this: humanity operates in cycles. We rise, we peak, we decline, we fall. Then we begin again. Each cycle, we climb a little higher. We remember a little more. We evolve a little further, but we also repeat the same mistakes. We develop technology faster than wisdom. We fragment into competing groups. We exhaust our resources. We trigger environmental collapse, and then the cycle resets. The 7th world, the completion, represents the potential to break this pattern, to evolve beyond the cycle of rise and fall, to achieve a stable state of consciousness that doesn't require catastrophe to renew itself. But we're not there yet. We're in the 5th cycle, and the patterns suggest we're approaching the crisis point. The same crisis point that every previous cycle reached. Let me be specific about the timing. We're approximately 12.0 years past the Younger Dryas event, the catastrophe that ended the previous cycle. The precession cycle is 25,920 years. Half a cycle is 12,960 years. We're approaching the halfway point, and at the halfway point, the model suggests there's a transition. A moment of maximum instability. A choice point. This is not mystical speculation. This is pattern recognition. Every 12,000 to 13.0 years, there's evidence of major climate disruption. Ice core data shows this. Sediment layers show this. The geological record shows periodic catastrophes at roughly this interval. We are, right now, within the window where the pattern would predict another disruption. Now, does this mean catastrophe is inevitable? That we're doomed to repeat the cycle exactly as it has happened before? No, and this is crucial. This is why the ancient teachers encoded this knowledge. This is why they tried so hard to preserve it. Because if you can see the pattern, you have the possibility of changing it. If you understand that you're in a cycle, you can make different choices. You can prepare, you can adapt, you can evolve. The cycle is not fate, it's tendency. It's what happens when consciousness remains asleep, when humanity moves through history reactively rather than consciously. But consciousness can wake up, patterns can be interrupted, choices can be made, and there are signs that something is shifting. That this cycle might be different. For the first time in human history, we have global communication. The internet has connected the entire planet. Knowledge is no longer isolated in local traditions. It's accessible, shareable, virtually instantaneous. For the first time, we have a comprehensive archaeological record. We can see the evidence of previous cycles. We can recognize the pattern. For the first time, we have the scientific method, a systematic way of testing claims, of separating signal from noise, of building reliable knowledge that can be transmitted clearly. And for the first time, we're beginning to rediscover the ancient wisdom. Quantum physics is revealing that consciousness plays a fundamental role in reality, just as the mystics always said. Ecology is showing us that everything is interconnected, just as indigenous traditions always taught. Neuroscience is confirming that meditation and contemplative practices alter brain structure and function, Just as the yogis always knew, we are at a convergence point. Ancient wisdom and modern science are beginning to align. This has never happened before. Not in any previous cycle that we have evidence of. Which means we're in unprecedented territory. Which means the possibility exists that this time we might break the pattern. But only if we recognize it. Only if we understand what's happening. The cosmic clock is ticking. The great year is turning. The seventh world is approaching its crisis point. And the question facing us is the same question that has faced every previous cycle. Will we remember? Or will we forget? Will we preserve the knowledge? Or will we let it scatter again? Will we evolve? Or will we repeat? The pattern has played out 6 times before, according to the ancient model. 6 great cycles rising and falling. 6 worlds created and destroyed. We are the 7th, the completion of the cycle. And completion can mean 2 things. It can mean the end, the final collapse, the extinction of humanity's potential. Or it can mean fulfillment. The achievement of the goal. The graduation from the cycle. The choice is not made by civilization as a whole. It's made by individuals. By the choices each of us makes about how to live. What to value, what to preserve. The guardians of the previous cycles did their part. They encoded the knowledge. They preserved it through catastrophe. They passed it forward to us. Now it's our turn. We're standing at the threshold. The door is open. The pattern is visible. What we do next will determine which kind of 7th world we become. The one that completes the cycle? Or the one that begins it again? There is a layer in the geological record that should not exist. A boundary line. A thin stratum of sediment that appears across multiple continents, dating to approximately 12,800 years ago. Within this layer, scientists have found something remarkable. Microscopic diamonds. Nanodiamonds. These are not formed by normal geological processes. They require extreme heat and pressure. The kind of conditions you find into places deep in the Earth's mantle, or in an impact event. Someone took samples from this layer and analyzed them. The nanodiamonds are there, along with iridium, platinum, and other elements that are rare in Earth's crust but common in meteorites and comets. The conclusion is uncomfortable but increasingly accepted. Approximately 12,800 years ago, Earth was struck by fragments of a comet. Not a single impact. Multiple air bursts and impacts across the northern hemisphere. Enough to trigger immediate climate change. Enough to ignite wildfires across entire continents. Enough to destabilize the ice sheets and cause catastrophic flooding. This is not mythology, this is geology. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, as it's called, provides a physical mechanism for the catastrophe that the myths describe, and it confirms the pattern. Let me walk you through what the evidence suggests happened. 12,800 years ago, Earth was warming. The Ice Age was ending. Glaciers were retreating. Sea levels were rising gradually. Human populations were expanding. In the Middle East, people were beginning to experiment with cultivation, with the intentional planting of wild grains. The climate was becoming stable, favorable, hospitable. Then, in the span of a few years, possibly a few days, everything changed. A fragmented comet entered Earth's atmosphere. Multiple pieces, each one capable of releasing energy equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons. Some fragments exploded in the atmosphere, creating airbursts that ignited forests across North America, Europe, and Asia. The evidence of these fires is in the charcoal layer that appears in sediment cores from this time. Other fragments struck ice sheets directly. The Laurentide ice sheet, which covered most of Canada and the northern United States, was hit. The impact melted massive amounts of ice instantly, releasing floods of meltwater. Other fragments struck the ocean, generating tsunamis that would have inundated coastal areas globally. The immediate effects would have been catastrophic, but the long-term effects were worse. The meltwater from the ice sheets poured into the North Atlantic. Billions of tons of fresh water, colder and less dense than seawater, formed a layer on the ocean's surface. This disrupted the thermaline circulation, the ocean conveyor belt that distributes heat around the planet. When this circulation shut down, the warming stopped. The northern hemisphere plunged back into Ice Age conditions. Temperature in Greenland dropped by 15 degrees Celsius in less than a decade, possibly in a single year. This is not gradual climate change. This is a switch being flipped, a system reorganizing itself catastrophically. The glaciers that had been retreating began to advance again. The sea level rise paused. The forests that had been spreading into previously glaciated areas died back. And the human populations that had been thriving along the coasts, in the river valleys, in the newly temperate zones, suddenly found themselves in a world that was hostile again. Food sources collapsed. Animal migrations changed. The plants people had been cultivating failed. This is what the Younger Dryas event was. A sudden, violent return to Ice Age conditions, triggered by an extraterrestrial impact. And it lasted for 1,200 years. 12 centuries of cold, 12 centuries of survival mode. 12 centuries during which any complex society would have been strained to the breaking point. The archaeological record shows this. Across the northern hemisphere, there are gaps. Sites that were occupied continuously suddenly show abandonment. Till technologies change. Population levels drop. The Clovis culture in North America, recognizable by its distinctive spear points, disappears from the record, not gradually, abruptly. In the Middle East, there's evidence of population collapse. Sites that show signs of permanent settlement are abandoned. People return to mobile lifestyles, to hunting and gathering. In Europe, the same pattern. Settlements empty. The archaeological signature changes. Something happened. Something that forced populations to scatter, to migrate, to abandon the progress they had made toward complexity. Then, 600 years ago, it ended. As suddenly as it began, the climate flipped again. The ice sheets collapsed. The warming resumed. Within decades, temperatures returned to the levels they had been before the event. Sea levels rose rapidly. Very rapidly. Meltwater pulse 1b, as geologists call it, a sudden release of water from the disintegrating ice sheets. In some areas, sea level rose by several meters in less than a century. Coastlines that had been stable for thousands of years were inundated. If you were living on the coast, you would have watched the water rise. Year by year, the sea encroaching, settlements flooded, land swallowed. This is the flood, the real flood, not a global deluge that covered the entire planet, but a rapid, catastrophic sea level rise that would have been experienced as world ascending by the populations affected. And as we've established, most populations work coastal. The Ice Age coastlines, now underwater, were prime habitat. If there was any complexity, any social organization, any accumulation of knowledge, it was there, and it was drowned. The survivors moved inland. They carried what they could. They told stories about what was lost, about the cities beneath the waves, about the time before the flood when things were different. And they began again, slowly, rebuilding, relearning, reinventing. But they weren't starting from zero. They had fragments. They had techniques. They had knowledge passed down orally, practices preserved in ritual, understanding encoded in ways that could survive even if the context was lost. This is why agriculture appears suddenly in the archaeological record. Not because it was invented suddenly, but because it was being reconstructed. The survivors knew about cultivation. They had practiced it before the catastrophe. When conditions stabilized, they resumed. This is why Gul, Bktati, appears fully formed. Not because hunter-gatherers suddenly developed the ability to build monumental architecture, but because the knowledge of how to build had been preserved. They were rebuilding, attempting to recreate what had existed before. This is why the Sumerian civilization appears with complete systems already in place. Not because they invented everything overnight, but because they inherited it from survivors, from teachers, from the APK who emerged from the sea. The sea, the flood, the catastrophe. The pattern is consistent. But here's the crucial question. Was this the first time? Was the Younger Dryas event the only catastrophe? The only collapse? The only cycle of rise and fall? The geological record says no. There are multiple impact layers. multiple boundaries in the sediment that show evidence of extraterrestrial impacts. The most famous is the K-T boundary, 66 million years ago, that marks the extinction of the dinosaurs. A massive asteroid impact that triggered global climate change and mass extinction. But there are others, smaller events that affected regional climates, caused tsunamis, triggered volcanic activity, and they happen with disturbing regularity. Not random events scattered across deep time, periodic events clustered around certain intervals. Why? One theory is that Earth passes through debris fields left by comets. The solar system is not empty space. It contains dust, ice fragments, rocky debris left by comets that have broken apart. Earth's orbit takes us through these debris fields periodically, and when we do, the chance of impacts increases. The Tauri meteor stream is one such debris field. Earth passes through it twice a year, in June and November. Most of the time, we see meteor showers, beautiful, harmless, but embedded in the stream are larger fragments. Minuscular asteroids. Comets, fragments capable of triggering regional catastrophes. Astronomers have been tracking these, and they're concerned, because we're currently moving into a denser part of the stream, a period spanning several decades, when the risk of a significant impact is elevated. This is not fringe speculation. This is orbital mechanics. This is data from telescopes in spectroscopy and analysis and trajectory calculations. We are, right now, in a higher minus risk period for comet impacts, just as we were 800 years ago. The pattern is repeating, and it's not just impacts. There are other periodic threats. Solar activity follows cycles. The sun's magnetic field flips every 11 years. These are minor cycles, but there are longer cycles too. Grand solar minimums and maximas that affect Earth climate on centennial and millennial scales. The Maunder minimum, from 1645 to 1715, was a period of very low solar activity. It corresponded with the Little Ice Age in Europe. Crop failures, famine, social upheaval, that was a minor event. A temporary dip in solar output. But there's evidence of more severe solar events in the past. Superflares, coronal mass ejections powerful enough to strip away parts of Earth's atmosphere if they hit directly. These events leave signatures in ice cores and tree rings. Sudden spikes in radioactive isotopes, created when high-minus energy particles from the sun interact with Earth's atmosphere. The Carrington event in 1859 was one such event. A massive solar flare that caused aurora visible at tropical latitudes and induced electrical currents strong enough to set telegraph equipment on fire. If a similar event occurred today, it would destroy electrical grids, satellite networks, communication systems. Modern civilization would be severely disrupted. And the geological record suggests that more powerful events have occurred, events that would have been catastrophic for any technology minus dependent civilization. These events are periodic, correlated with solar cycles, predictable to some extent. We're entering a solar maximum. The sun's activity is increasing, the risk is increasing. Again, the pattern is repeating. Then there's volcanic activity. Supervolcanoes capable of ejecting so much ash into the atmosphere that they trigger volcanic winters lasting years or decades. The Tubuai eruption, approximately 74,000 years ago, was one such event. It ejected an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material. The ash blanketed South Asia. The sulfur dioxide caused global cooling for at least a decade. The human population crashed. Genetic evidence shows a severe bottleneck around this time. The global population may have dropped to as few as 10,000 individuals. We nearly went extinct. Our species was reduced to a few scattered groups, clinging to survival in isolated refugia. But we recovered, we rebuilt, and eventually we spread across the planet again. This is the pattern at the species level. Collapse and recovery, near minus extinction and resurgence. And it has happened multiple times. The genetic evidence shows multiple bottlenecks. Multiple moments when the population crashed and then rebounded. Each bottleneck is a catastrophe. Each bottleneck is a reset. Each bottleneck is a moment when knowledge is lost, when complexity collapses, when survivors have to begin again with fragments. So when the ancient texts describe previous worlds destroyed by fire, by ice, by flood, they are not being metaphorical. They are describing real events. Catastrophes that have occurred repeatedly throughout human history. The third world destroyed by fire, that could be the 2BA eruption. Or one of the other supervolcanic events that have occurred in the past 100,000 years. The fourth world destroyed by flood, that's the Younger Dryas termination. The rapid sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. The second world destroyed by ice. That could be the onset of the last glacial maximum, 26,000 years ago, when ice sheets advanced and forced populations to migrate or die. These are not myths. These are memories, distorted by time, mythologized by repetition, but rooted in actual events, and the pattern suggests there will be a fifth catastrophe. Fifth moment when civilization collapses and survivors have to carry knowledge forward into a new beginning. Now here's what makes this urgent. We are living in a period of compounding risks. Climate change is destabilizing weather patterns, causing sea level rise, increasing the frequency of extreme events. We are entering a solar maximum, increasing the risk of solar flares that could damage infrastructure. We are passing through a denser part of the Taurida meteor stream, increasing the risk of impacts. Geologists monitor dozens of volcanoes worldwide that are capable of catastrophic eruptions. Yellowstone, TBA, can't be flagged REI. Any of them could erupt. Not imminently, but within the time frame that matters for civilization planning. And we have added new risks that didn't exist in previous cycles. Nuclear weapons, bioengineered pathogens, artificial intelligence advancing faster than our ability to control it. We are, objectively, in a period of elevated risk. Multiple independent threat vectors, all active simultaneously. The pattern would predict this. The ancient model would predict that as we approach the transition point in the cycle, instability increases, not because of divine punishment, not because of cosmic fate, but because of physics, because of orbital mechanics, because of solar cycles, because of geological processes. The catastrophes are natural, recurring, periodic, and we are in the window. But here is what's different this time. We can see it coming. Previous iterations of humanity, previous cycles, they experienced the catastrophes without warning. The impacts came from the sky without prediction. The climate shifted without understanding of why. They could only react, only survive, only preserve what they couldn't hope it would be enough. But we have telescopes, we have climate models. We have seismometers and satellite monitoring and genetic analysis. We can see the patterns. We can identify the risks. We can, to some extent, prepare. This is unprecedented. No previous cycle had this capability. Which means we have a choice that they didn't have. We can attempt to preserve knowledge intentionally. We can create redundant systems. We can encode information in multiple forms, in multiple locations, in ways designed to survive catastrophe. We can etch instructions onto metal plates designed to last 10,000 years. We can encode information in DNA, in satellite archives, in distributed networks that have no single point of failure. We can become conscious guardians, not hoping that knowledge survives by accident, but ensuring it survives by design. But preservation is not enough, because the real knowledge, the knowledge that matters, is not technical information, it's wisdom. It's understanding of how to live in balance, how to organize societies that don't inevitably tend toward collapse, how to develop technology without developing it faster than the wisdom to use it responsibly. This is what every previous cycle failed at. This is the pattern that repeats. They developed capabilities. They built complex societies. They accumulated power. But they did not develop the wisdom to use power wisely. They did not create social structures that could remain stable across generations. They did not learn how to live in balance with the planetary systems that support life. And so they collapsed. Not because of external catastrophe alone, but because of internal fragility. Because complexity without wisdom is brittle. And then the external catastrophe came, and the brittle system shattered. The ancient mystery schools understood this. This is why they focused on transformation of consciousness, not accumulation of knowledge. They understood that information without wisdom is dangerous, that power without understanding leads to destruction, that the crisis facing humanity is not technological but spiritual. This is why the initiations were difficult, why they required facing death, confronting shadow, surrendering ego. Because the wisdom they were imparting was not intellectual. It was experiential. It was a transformation of being. And this transformation is what allows knowledge to be used wisely, what allows complexity to be stable, what allows civilization to reach the seventh stage without collapsing. But this transformation has to occur at scale. It's not enough for a few initiates to understand. Enough of humanity has to wake up, to see the pattern, to choose differently. And that's what's happening now, slowly, unevenly, but measurably. Meditation practices that were once restricted to monasteries are now taught globally. Psychological understanding that was once hidden in mystery schools is now available in therapy and self-help books. Scientific research is confirming what contemplative traditions always knew about consciousness: connection, transformation. The knowledge is spreading. The guardians have done their job. They preserved it through the dark ages, through the collapses, through the periods when it would have been destroyed if it had been public. Now it's public. Now it's available. Now the choice is ours. We are standing at the same threshold that every previous cycle stood at. The threshold between complexity and collapse, between evolution and repetition, between graduation and reset. The catastrophes will come. The risks are real. The pattern suggests disruption is likely within the next few centuries, possibly within our lifetimes. But unlike previous cycles, we can see it. We can prepare. We can choose. We can preserve knowledge intentionally. We can transform consciousness deliberately. We can create systems designed to survive instability. Or we can ignore the pattern. We can remain asleep. We can assume that catastrophe won't happen to us, that we're special, that the cycle won't repeat. And if we make that choice, we will repeat. We will collapse. Our knowledge will scatter. And the survivors will begin again, carrying fragments, trying to rebuild. And someday, thousands of years from now, archaeologists will excavate our ruins and wonder what we knew, how we built, why we fell, and they will find traces, encoded in our monuments, preserved in our myths, written in the geological layer we left behind. And they will face the same choice we're facing now, unless we break the pattern, unless we become the cycle that remembers, the iteration that learns, the seventh world, the completion, not another reset, but a transformation. There's a document that shouldn't exist. It's called the Piri-Reis map, and we've mentioned it before. But there's a detail I haven't told you yet. When Ottoman Admiral Piri-Reis compiled this map in 1513, he wrote notes in the margins explaining his sources. He said he used approximately 20 older maps, some dating to the time of Alexander the Great or earlier. But one note stands out. He describes a map that came from a sailor in Columbus's crew, a man who had been captured and interrogated. And this sailor, according to Piri-Reis, possessed a map that showed lands across the Atlantic. Before Columbus officially discovered them, someone knew. Before the official discovery, someone had maps. But here's the detail that should make you uncomfortable. The note says this sailor's map came from even older sources, from the time of Alexander, from the Library of Alexandria, which means that in 300 BCE, there were maps showing the Americas, before the Vikings, before the Polynesian voyages, before any documented contact between the Old and New Worlds. Someone had crossed the Atlantic. Someone had surveyed both continents. Someone had created a global map, and then that knowledge was lost, preserved only in fragments, copied and recopied, until pieces of it emerged in the 16th century, where we could find them and wonder how they were possible. This is what inheritance looks like. Fragments of capabilities that seem impossible for the time period, because they're not from the time period. They're from before. Now let me show you something else. Something that should make the pattern visible. There is a description of Atlantis that comes from Plato, written around 360 BCE. Most people know the story. An advanced civilization on an island that sank beneath the waves in a single day and night. Most people assume it's a parable, a philosophical thought experiment, a made-up story to illustrate a point about hubris and divine punishment. But Plato insisted it was real. He claimed his ancestor Solon heard the story from Egyptian priests at Sais, who said their records went back 9,000 years before Solon's time, which places Atlantis around 9,600 BCE, right at the end of the Younger Dryas, right at the moment of the catastrophic sea level rise. And what do the Egyptian priests describe? They describe Atlantis as having technology, organization, and capabilities that seem impossible for the date given. They describe a naval power, ships capable of crossing oceans, a civilization that had mapped the known world. They describe advanced agriculture, cities laid out in geometric patterns, metalworking, monumental architecture, and they describe its destruction, not gradually, suddenly, by earthquakes and floods. In a single day and night, the island sank. This is not mythology. This is disaster geology described by people who didn't have the vocabulary for plate tectonics and tsunami waves. This is a memory of the catastrophe, preserved for 9,000 years in Egyptian temple records, until a Greek philosopher wrote it down and it survived to reach us. But here's what the Egyptian priests said that should terrify us. They told Solon that the Atlanteans became corrupt, that in their later years, they lost their virtue. They became greedy, aggressive, imperialistic. They tried to conquer the known world, and specifically, the priests said this when they were being corrupted by an admixture of too much mortal human nature, and the divine portion began to fade away in them. They grew blind with pride. Read that again. Too much mortal human nature, the divine portion began to fade. This is describing a loss of wisdom, a severing from higher consciousness, a descent into purely material concerns. And this descent, the priest said, preceded the catastrophe. The civilization fell internally before it fell physically. The pattern is moral collapse followed by physical collapse, spiritual blindness followed by catastrophic destruction. This is the same pattern described in the Bible. Sodom and Gomorrah, corrupt cities destroyed by fire from the sky. The same pattern in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods sending a flood because humanity had become wicked and violent. The same pattern in Hindu texts. The end of each yuga comes when Dharma, cosmic order, has declined to its lowest point. The pattern is universal. Civilizations that lose their way morally are more vulnerable to destruction physically. And now in 2025, we need to look in the mirror. Let me describe a civilization. Tell me if this sounds familiar. A civilization that has achieved unprecedented technological capability, that has harnessed energy sources that would seem like magic to previous generations, that can communicate instantly across the planet, that can fly through the air, that can manipulate the fundamental building blocks of matter in life. A civilization that has connected the entire world through trade networks, that has populations concentrated in massive urban centers, that depends on complex supply chains and centralized infrastructure. A civilization where wealth is concentrated in a small elite while the majority struggle, where the gap between rich and poor widens yearly, where ancient ecosystems are destroyed for short-term profit, where the pursuit of growth has become the singular organizing principle. A civilization that has the capability to destroy itself. Multiple ways. Nuclear weapons that can render the planet uninhabitable. Biological research that could create pathogens we cannot control. Artificial intelligence systems whose capabilities might exceed our ability to constrain them. Climate modification on a scale that threatens the stability of the biosphere. A civilization that has more information available than any previous culture, but where truth is increasingly difficult to discern. Where propaganda and manipulation have become sophisticated. Where attention itself has been weaponized, where division is profitable and therefore encouraged. A civilization that has largely lost connection to the sacred. Where the dominant worldview is materialistic, reductionist, where consciousness is explained away as an epiphenomenon of brain chemistry. Where meaning must be constructed because it's assumed there is no inherent meaning to find. Am I describing Atlantis? Or am I describing us? The parallels are precise, disturbingly precise. The ancient accounts describe Atlantis as having crystal technology, devices that could harness energy, transmit information, amplify intention. We have silicon technology, crystals, technically, devices that harness electromagnetic energy, transmit information globally, and amplify human capabilities. The accounts describe Atlantis as having flying machines. Viman, as in the Sanskrit texts, aircraft capable of crossing vast distances. We have airplanes, rockets, satellites. We've achieved flight in forms that would seem impossible to previous generations. The accounts describe Atlantis as having the ability to manipulate life itself, to create hybrid creatures, to alter the natural order. We have genetic engineering, CRISPR technology that can edit DNA with precision, the capability to create entirely new organisms that have never existed in nature. The accounts describe Atlantis as being globally connected, as having colonies and trade routes spanning continents. We have globalization, supply chains that circle the planet, economic systems where disruption in one region cascades globally, and the accounts describe Atlantis as being in a state of moral decline when it fell. Are we? Look at the metrics. Measure what we value. We value economic growth over ecological health, quarterly profits over long-term sustainability, individual success over collective well-being. We have normalized inequality. We accept that some people have more wealth than they could spend in 1,000 lifetimes while others starve. We have normalized surveillance. We carry tracking devices voluntarily. We've surrendered privacy for convenience. We have normalized distraction. The average person spends hours daily consuming content designed to keep them engaged, addicted, purchasing. We have normalized division. Political polarization has reached levels where people cannot even agree on basic facts, where the other side is not just wrong but evil, where compromise is seen as betrayal. This is not judgment. This is observation. These are the metrics of a civilization in decline. Not technological decline, moral decline, spiritual decline, the same decline that ancient texts describe in the civilizations that fell before. And here's what should frighten us most: we know this. We can see it, and yet we seem unable to change course. Every year, scientists release reports showing that we're approaching irreversible tipping points in the climate system. Every year, those reports are filed away and largely ignored. Every year, technologists warn about the risks of artificial intelligence development without adequate safety measures. Every year, investment in AI capabilities accelerates while investment in AI safety lags far behind. Every year, social scientists document increasing polarization, decreasing social cohesion, rising rates of depression and anxiety. Every year, the systems that generate these problems remain unchanged. We are collectively watching ourselves approach the cliff, and we are not turning. Why? Because the systems we've created have momentum. They have their own logic. They reward short-term thinking and punish long-term planning. They incentivize extraction and penalize conservation. They amplify division and suppress unity. We are locked into trajectories that we cannot easily alter, not because change is impossible, but because the cost of change seems too high. Because changing course would require sacrifice, would require letting go of comforts, would require transformation, and transformation is difficult. Transformation requires facing what we've become, requires admitting we've gone wrong, requires the humility to learn from the past. This is what the Atlanteans could not do, according to the accounts. They could not humble themselves. They could not admit they had lost their way. They remained blind with pride until the catastrophe came. Are we repeating this pattern? But there's something else in the mirror, something the ancient texts emphasize that we haven't discussed yet. The survivors, the ones who made it through the catastrophe, the ones who carried knowledge forward. Not everyone perished. Not everyone was destroyed. There were always survivors, always guardians who preserved the wisdom and passed it to the next cycle. Who were they? How did they survive when civilizations fell around them? The texts give us clues. And the clues are consistent. The survivors were those who maintained connection to the sacred, who practiced the disciplines of consciousness, who lived with awareness, preparation, and humility. They were the monks, the initiates, the spiritual practitioners, the ones who had not become fully absorbed into the material complexity of their civilizations. They were living at the edges, in the mountains, in the temples, in the communities that maintained older ways. When the catastrophe came, when the cities fell, when the complex systems collapsed, these edge-dwellers had the resilience to survive. They had skills, they had knowledge, they had community structures not dependent on the failing systems, and they had something else. They had the wisdom to recognize the pattern. They had been expecting this, not the specific form it would take, but the fact that it would come. They were the ones who remembered that cycles turn, that rise is followed by fall, that complexity tends toward collapse, so they prepared. Not with stockpiles and bunkers, though they may have had those, but with consciousness, with practices that could survive material loss, with knowledge encoded in forms that didn't depend on books or computers or institutions. They prepared by becoming the kind of humans who could survive, who could rebuild, who could carry wisdom forward. And this is the choice we're facing now. Not as a civilization, because civilizations don't make choices, as individuals. Do we continue participating unconsciously in systems we know are unsustainable? Do we continue consuming, accumulating, distracting ourselves? Or do we begin preparing? Not just materially, though practical preparedness matters, but consciously, by becoming the kind of humans who could be guardians, by developing resilience, by learning skills, by building communities based on real relationship rather than abstract connection, by practicing disciplines that strengthen consciousness, meditation, contemplation, the intentional development of awareness, by preserving knowledge, not just technical knowledge, though that matters too, but wisdom, understanding of how to live in balance, teachings about the patterns of rise and fall, stories that encode the lessons of previous cycles, by becoming, in other words, the mystery schools, the guardians, the edge-dwellers who will carry knowledge forward when the center fails. This is not pessimism. This is realism. This is pattern recognition. The cycle will turn. The transition will come. We can pretend otherwise, but the evidence suggests we're in the window. And when it comes, when the systems we depend on become unreliable, when complexity unravels, there will be survivors. There are always survivors. The question is, who will they be? What will they preserve? How will they ensure that the next cycle has a better foundation than this one? We are the potential guardians. Everyone listening to this, everyone who has recognized the pattern, everyone who has chosen to look at what we're facing rather than looking away. You are the ones who could carry knowledge forward, who could ensure that this collapse, if it comes, is not total, that some wisdom survives, that the next iteration has a chance to do better. This is not about survival for its own sake. It's not about saving yourself while others perish. That's the old paradigm. The Atlantean paradigm, the paradigm of separation and competition. The new paradigm, the wisdom that needs to be preserved, is about interconnection, about community, about recognizing that we're all expressions of the same consciousness, and that harming another is harming ourselves. This wisdom is not new, it's ancient. It's been taught by every genuine spiritual tradition. It's been encoded in the mystery schools. It's been preserved precisely so we could access it now, at this moment when we need it most. And the teaching is this: transformation begins individually, but must become collective. You cannot change civilization directly, but you can change yourself. And in changing yourself, you change the field, you affect everyone around you. You become a node in a network of consciousness that could, if enough nodes activate, tip the entire system toward a different state. This is not magical thinking. This is systems theory. This is how phase transitions work. You reach a critical threshold, and suddenly the entire system reorganizes. Water at 99 degrees Celsius is liquid. Water at 100 degrees is gas. 1 degree of change, and the entire structure transforms. Humanity is approaching a threshold. We can feel it. The instability, the uncertainty, the sense that we are in the liminal space between one age and another. And what happens at the threshold depends on how many of us are conscious. How many of us have done the inner work? How many of us are prepared, not just to survive, but to serve as templates for what comes next? In the ancient Egyptian mysteries, there was a teaching called the weighing of the heart. When you died, your heart would be placed on a scale. On the other side was a feather, the feather of Mayat, representing truth in cosmic order. If your heart was heavier than the feather, weighed down by attachments, fears, regrets, you could not proceed. You remained bound to the cycle of death and rebirth. But if your heart was as light as a feather, if you had released the heavy densities of ego and fear, you could pass through. You could transcend the cycle. This is not just death mythology. This is a teaching about how to live, how to move through a world of complexity and suffering without becoming weighted down by it. The heart made light is the consciousness that can survive the collapse of form. That doesn't depend on external structures for its stability. That remains centered even when everything is falling apart. This is the consciousness we need to develop. Not to escape the world, but to serve it. To be stable points around which new patterns can crystallize when the old patterns dissolve. And here's the paradox: preparing for collapse is also how you prevent it. Because if enough people become conscious, if enough people do the inner work, if enough people shift from the paradigm of separation to the paradigm of connection, the collapse might not need to happen. Or it might happen in a gentler way, a transformation rather than a catastrophe. The transition is coming. The cycle is turning. But how it turns depends on us. We can cling to what's failing and be dragged down with it, or we can release, transform, and become the bridge to what comes next. The ancient wisdom is clear: nothing is permanent. All forms arise and dissolve. Fighting this truth creates suffering. Accepting it creates freedom. Atlantis tried to make itself permanent. It tried to hold on, to extend its dominance, to prevent the inevitable turning of the cycle, and it was destroyed utterly. So utterly that for thousands of years, most people didn't even believe it had existed. We have the chance to do this differently, to go willingly into the transformation, to participate consciously in the turning, to become the guardians who ensure that what matters survives, not the technology, necessarily, not the complexity, but the wisdom, the consciousness, the understanding that we are all connected, that the earth is sacred, that every action ripples through the web of existence. This wisdom is what needs to survive. This wisdom is what the guardians have always preserved. This wisdom is what we're being called to embody now. Because we are the seventh world, the completion of the cycle, and completion means we finally integrate the lesson. We finally remember. We finally break the pattern of unconscious repetition. Or we become another layer in the geological record, another mystery for future archaeologists to puzzle over. Another lost civilization that had so much potential and couldn't quite make the leap. The choice is ours, not as a species, as individuals, as moments of consciousness choosing, right now, how to be in relation to what's coming. Do we remain asleep? Or do we wake up? The mirror is showing us clearly what we've become. The question is whether we have the courage to look, and having looked, whether we have the commitment to change. Before we go further, I need you to do something. Pause for a moment. Actually pause. Stop whatever else you're doing. Now ask yourself, what time is it where you are? Are you watching this in daylight or darkness? Is it morning, afternoon, evening, night? And more importantly, what are you feeling right now? Because if you've followed this far, if you've allowed yourself to see the pattern, you're probably feeling something uncomfortable. A mix of recognition and resistance. A sense that something true is being spoken, combined with a desire to dismiss it as speculation. This discomfort is important. It's not a sign that you should stop listening. It's a sign that you're approaching something real. Truth feels different than information. Information lands in the mind. Truth lands in the body. It creates a resonance, a recognition, sometimes an anxiety. What you're feeling is the vertigo of seeing patterns that our culture has trained us not to see. The cognitive dissonance of holding a perspective that contradicts the dominant narrative. The dominant narrative says we are at the apex of human achievement. That history is a story of linear progress. That we're the most advanced humans who have ever lived. That the future will be an extension of the present, only more so. But the pattern we've been examining suggests something different. It suggests we're in the middle of a cycle that has turned before. That advancement is temporary. That collapse is as natural as growth. That we might be repeating mistakes that have been made many times before. And if that's true, if we're not at the apex, but at the precipice, then everything changes. Your choices change, your priorities change, your relationship to time changes. So I'm asking you again, what are you feeling? Drop a comment, not analysis, not agreement or disagreement. Just what you're actually feeling in this moment, in your body, as you consider the possibility that we're the seventh iteration of a pattern that has already failed 6 times. Tell me where you are. Tell me where you are. Tell me what time it is. Tell me what this recognition feels like, because we're in this together. All of us scattered across this planet, across time zones, across cultures, all of us looking at the same pattern, all of us facing the same choice. And the choice is not hypothetical. It's not something for future generations to worry about. It's happening now. It's happening in every moment. It's happening in how you live your life today. Let me be specific about what I mean by choice. Not the big dramatic choice. Not the moment where you single-handedly save or doom civilization. The small choices. The ones you make every day. The ones that seem insignificant but compound over time. Do you participate in systems you know are destructive? Do you give your energy, your attention, your money to patterns that are unsustainable? Or do you begin withdrawing? Do you begin redirecting your resources toward regenerative patterns? Do you begin building something that could survive the transition? Do you consume unconsciously? Or do you consume consciously, aware of the consequences of every purchase, every choice? Do you distract yourself constantly? Or do you create space for silence, for contemplation, for the deep work of consciousness? Do you remain isolated? Or do you build real community, relationships based on trust and mutual support rather than transaction and convenience? Do you accumulate, or do you practice letting go, training yourself to hold things lightly, preparing for the possibility that material security is temporary? These are not rhetorical questions. These are the actual choices that determine whether you're part of the pattern or part of the pattern breaking. Because here's what the ancient model tells us about the seventh world. It's not just another iteration. It's the completion of a cycle, and completion means integration. It means taking everything learned from the previous 6 attempts and finally getting it right. The first world learned about physical embodiment, the transition from pure consciousness into matter. The second world learned about duality, the experience of self and other, light and dark, the fundamental polarities. The third world learned about creation, about manifesting form, building, making, the Lemurian builders. The fourth world learned about power, about harnessing energy, developing technology, organizing complexity, Atlantis at its height. The fifth world, our world, is learning about consequences, about what happens when power exceeds wisdom, about the unsustainability of growth without balance. The sixth world, which some say is beginning to emerge now in certain individuals, will learn about unity, about the reintegration of the fragmentations that have dominated the previous cycles. And the seventh world will integrate all of it, will demonstrate that consciousness can inhabit matter without being trapped by it. That technology can be developed without destroying ecology. That complexity can be stable. But this integration doesn't happen automatically. It happens through choice, through conscious evolution, through enough individuals making the leap that the collective field shifts. And this is where the modern scientific understanding converges with the ancient mystical understanding in a way that should take your breath away. Quantum physics has demonstrated something called the observer effect. The act of observation affects the observed. Consciousness is not separate from physical reality. It's part of the system. It influences outcomes. Epigenetics has shown that consciousness, expressed through choices in environment, can activate or deactivate genes. The blueprint is not fixed. Expression depends on context, on behavior, on awareness. Neuroscience has confirmed that meditation and contemplative practices physically alter brain structure, that consciousness can reshape its own hardware, that we are not fixed entities, but processes of continuous becoming. Systems theory shows that complex systems can undergo phase transitions, that when enough nodes in a network change state, the entire system can suddenly reorganize into a new configuration. All of this validates what the mystery schools were teaching thousands of years ago. Consciousness is primary. Physical reality is responsive to awareness. Transformation at the individual level can cascade into transformation at the collective level. The ancients encoded this knowledge in mythology because they didn't have the vocabulary of quantum physics and neuroscience, but they understood the principles. They understood that reality is participatory, that we're not passive observers but active co-minus creators. And they understood that at moments of maximum instability, at the turning points of cycles, individual consciousness matters more than at any other time. Because at stable points in the cycle, the momentum of collective patterns is overwhelming. The individual can do little to change the trajectory. But at unstable points, at threshold moments, everything is in flux. The system is sensitive to initial conditions. Small changes can amplify into large effects. We are at such a moment now. Every indicator suggests we're in a period of maximum instability. Climate systems are becoming more erratic. Social systems are polarizing. Economic systems are showing signs of strain. Technological development is accelerating beyond our ability to integrate it wisely. This is not comfortable. Instability never is. But instability is also opportunity. Because when everything is in flux, when the old patterns are breaking down, new patterns can emerge. And which patterns emerge depends on what we're holding in consciousness, what we're practicing, what we're building. If we're holding fear, separation, scarcity, then those patterns will crystallize in the new configuration. But if we're holding love, connection, abundance, then those patterns have the potential to crystallize. This is not wishful thinking. This is how morphic fields work. This is how collective consciousness operates. We are not separate individuals accidentally interacting. We are nodes in a unified field. What we hold individually affects the field. The field affects everyone. The yogis knew this. The mystics knew this. The indigenous wisdom keepers knew this. And now quantum physics is confirming it. We are entangled. What happens to one affects all. Consciousness is non-local. The observer and the observed are aspects of a unified process, which means your consciousness matters. Your choices matter, not just for you, for the whole. Every meditation session, every act of kindness, every moment of awareness contributes to the field. And every distraction, every unconscious reaction, every choice made from fear or greed contributes to the field too. We are voting constantly with our consciousness, voting for which reality will crystallize. The Hopi prophecies speak of this moment explicitly. They describe it as the time of the great purification, a period when humanity will face a choice between the paths. One path is technological. It's the continuation of the current trajectory. More complexity, more power, more control. But disconnected from the earth, from the sacred, from natural law. This path, the prophecies say, leads to destruction, not because the technology is evil, but because it's unbalanced. Power without wisdom, capability without consciousness. The other path is spiritual. It's a return to harmony with natural cycles, a remembering of our place within the web of life, a reintegration of the sacred into daily life. This path, the prophecies say, leads to survival and transformation, not by rejecting technology, but by subordinating it to wisdom, not by returning to primitive conditions, but by moving forward to a new synthesis. The prophecies say we're at the fork, and they say the choice will be made in this generation, not by governments, not by institutions, by individuals, by enough individuals choosing consciousness over unconsciousness, connection over separation, long-term wisdom over short-term gain. The Vedic tradition has a parallel teaching. They describe the transition from Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and fragmentation, to Satya Yuga, the age of truth and unity. This transition, they say, doesn't happen smoothly. There's a period of maximum darkness before the dawn, a period when all the shadows are brought to the surface, when everything hidden becomes visible, when the contradictions in the system become undeniable. We're in that period now. The shadows are surfacing. The contradictions are visible. The unsustainability is undeniable. This is painful, but it's also necessary. Because you kill what you cannot see. You cannot transform what you're unwilling to acknowledge. The darkness is not the problem. The darkness is the diagnosis. It's showing us what needs to change. And the teaching says that those who can remain conscious through this period, who can hold light while surrounded by darkness, who can maintain their center while everything is chaotic, these are the ones who will midwife the transition. These are the guardians, the bridge people, the ones who stand between ages. Not special people, not chosen ones, just people who chose to wake up, people who chose to do the work, people who chose to become stable points in an unstable field. And the work is not abstract. It's specific. It's practical. It begins with the body, with learning to be present in physical form, with treating the body as sacred, not as a machine to be optimized or a problem to be solved. Practices that ground consciousness in embodied experience. Yoga, martial arts, dance, anything that develops somatic awareness, that brings the mind into the body rather than leaving it trapped in conceptual thought. Then it moves to the breath, to the recognition that breath is the interface between conscious and unconscious, voluntary and involuntary, self and world. Practices that work with breath, pranayama, breath work. Meditation that uses breath as an anchor. Learning to regulate the nervous system, to shift states consciously, to use breath as a tool for transformation. Then it moves to the mind, to the recognition that most mental activity is unconscious, reactive, habitual. That the mind, left unattended, runs programs installed by trauma, by culture, by the collective unconscious. Practices that develop meditation, mindfulness, self-inquiry, learning to observe thoughts without being captured by them, learning to recognize patterns, learning to choose which thoughts to invest in and which to release. Then it moves to the heart, to the recognition that consciousness without compassion is incomplete, that wisdom without love is sterile, that the point of waking up is not just to see clearly, but to love more fully. Practices that open the heart, meditation, service, relationship work, forgiveness practices, anything that dismantles the walls between self and other, that reveals the fundamental interconnection. And finally it moves to the spiritual, to the recognition that you are not just a body, not just a mind, not just a personality, that you are consciousness itself, temporarily focused through this particular form. Practices that reconnect with source, prayer, contemplation, ceremony, time and nature, anything that restabilizes the sense of the sacred, that remembers the mystery, that opens to the intelligence that pervades all existence. This is the work. This is what the mystery schools were teaching. This is what transforms an ordinary human into a guardian. Not superhuman abilities, not special powers, just a human who is awake, embodied, conscious, connected, stable. A human who can hold presence while others are panicking, who can act from wisdom while others are reacting from fear, who can maintain connection while others are fragmenting into isolation. And when enough humans do this work, when enough nodes in the network reach a threshold level of consciousness, the entire system can flip. This is the teaching of the 100th monkey, the idea that there's a critical mass, and once it's reached, the learning spreads through the collective field, non-minus locally. Whether the 100th monkey story is literally true doesn't matter. The principle is sound. Phase transitions happen. Systems reorganize, and they do so suddenly, once a threshold is crossed. We don't know where the threshold is. We don't know how many conscious humans it takes to tip the collective field. But we know it's less than the majority. Systems theory suggests It might be as low as 10%, perhaps even lower if the conscious nodes are well minus distributed and highly coherent. Which means your work matters. Your consciousness contributes to the critical mass. You might be the node that tips the system, or you might be one of thousands of nodes that collectively create the tipping point. Either way, your participation is essential, but participation requires commitment. And commitment requires seeing clearly what we're facing. We're not going to fix this with technology alone. The problems we face are not technical problems. They're consciousness problems. We're not going to fix this with politics alone. The problems transcend political ideology. They're systemic. They're built into the paradigm itself. We're not going to fix this with economics alone. Sustainable economics requires a complete reimaging of value, purpose, and success. It requires consciousness shift. The only thing that can address problems at this level is transformation of consciousness. Individual transformation that becomes collective transformation, and transformation is not comfortable. It requires facing what we've avoided. It requires releasing what we've clung to. It requires dying to who we've been so we can become who we need to be. The mystery schools called this process initiation, death and rebirth, descent into the underworld and return transformed. And they understood that not everyone completes the initiation. Some turn back at the threshold. Some refuse the descent. Some get stuck in the underworld and never return. But those who complete it, those who make the journey and return, they bring back medicine. They bring back knowledge. They bring back capacity to serve. They become the bridge people. The ones who can hold both worlds. The ones who can speak the language of the old paradigm while embodying the new. These are the guardians, and we need them now. We need you to become one if you're being called to this. Because the seventh world will not manifest automatically. It will manifest through the choices of conscious individuals who commit to the work of transformation and then serve as stable points around which new patterns can form. The guardians of the previous cycles did their part. They preserved the knowledge. They passed it forward. They ensured we would have access to the teachings when we needed them. Now it's our turn. We are the generation standing at the choice point. We are the ones who will determine whether the seventh world becomes a completion or another collapse. And the determination will not be made by a single choice. It will be made by thousands of small choices, made daily, by millions of people, each one choosing consciousness over unconsciousness, each one choosing connection over separation, each one choosing to become a guardian. This is not burden. This is calling. This is purpose. This is what we're here for. Not to accumulate, not to achieve, not to be comfortable, but to participate in the most significant transition in human history. The moment when we either repeat the cycle or transcend it. The moment when we either become another lost civilization or we become the civilization that finally remembers the seventh world, the completion, the integration of everything learned through 6 previous attempts. We're here. The moment is now. The choice is ours. What will we choose? There's a question I haven't asked yet. The most important question. If the Sumerians knew they were inheriting knowledge from before, did they know which iteration they were? Did they know if they were the 3rd attempt, the 4th, the 5th, or did they, like us, believe they were the first? Because that's the pattern, isn't it? Every cycle believes it's unique. Every civilization thinks it's the pinnacle. Every generation assumes the world began with them and will continue indefinitely in the direction they're heading. This is the amnesia that the cycle depends on, the forgetting that ensures repetition. But what if this time is different? What if, for the first time, a civilization approaching its crisis point can actually see the pattern? What if consciousness has evolved just enough that we can recognize what we're doing before it's too late? Let me tell you what makes this iteration unprecedented. For the first time in human history, we have a global communication network. The internet has connected nearly the entire planet. Information that once took decades to spread now spreads in seconds. This has downsides, obviously. Misinformation spreads just as quickly as truth. Division and manipulation are easier than ever. But it also means that awakening can spread. That when one person sees the pattern, they can share it with millions. that consciousness can synchronize at a scale that was never possible before. The mystery schools had to preserve knowledge in secret, passing it to carefully selected initiates. The knowledge was bottlenecked by the speed of direct transmission, teacher to student, generation after generation, but now, anyone with internet access can encounter these teachings. The mystery school has become open source. The hidden wisdom is hiding in plain sight, available to anyone willing to look. This is revolutionary and terrifying, because it means the choice is truly distributed now, not in the hands of a few guardians, but in the hands of anyone who stumbles across this video, this idea, this pattern. For the first time in human history, we have a complete archaeological record. We can see the previous cycles. We can excavate the ruins, date the layers, map the coastlines that are now underwater. The Sumerians had fragments, stories passed down, maps copied from older sources, but they couldn't see the full scope. We can. We have satellite imagery, ground-minus penetrating radar, DNA analysis, I-scored ADA, sediment records going back hundreds of thousands of years. We can see the impact layers. We can track the climate shifts. We can measure the genetic bottlenecks. We can reconstruct what happened with a precision that no previous civilization had access to, which means we can see the pattern. Not just in mythology, not just in prophecy, but in hard data. And seeing the pattern changes everything. Because you cannot unsee it. Once you recognize that this has happened before, that we're following a trajectory that has led to collapse multiple times, willful ignorance becomes much more difficult. For the first time in human history, we have scientific understanding of consciousness itself. Neuroscience, psychology, quantum physics, systems theory, all converging on insights that the mystics have been teaching for millennia. Previous cycles had to frame these insights in religious or mythological language. They had to say the gods when they meant the organizing principles of consciousness. They had to say demons when they meant unconscious patterns that possess behavior. We have a vocabulary now. We can speak precisely about trauma, about shadow, about projection, about cognitive bias, about the neurological substrates of meditation. This doesn't diminish the spiritual dimension. It contextualizes it. It makes it accessible. It removes the unnecessary mystification while preserving the essential mystery. And this matters because transformation that can be explained can be taught. Systematically, reproducibly, at scale. We're not dependent on rare mystics having spontaneous awakenings and trying to describe the ineffable. We have maps. We have practices. We have frameworks that work. So for the first time, a civilization approaching its crisis point has three things simultaneously: global communication, comprehensive historical data, and scientific understanding of consciousness. This has never happened before, which means we're in truly unprecedented territory. We're the first iteration that can see what we're doing while we're doing it. And that creates the possibility, just the possibility, that we could choose differently. Not guaranteed, not automatic, but possible. But possibility requires participation. Potential requires actualization. And actualization happens through individuals making a choice. A choice that might seem small but reverberates through the field. The choice to wake up, to stop sleepwalking through life, to stop consuming unconsciously, working unconsciously, relating unconsciously, the choice to ask the big questions. Who am I, really? What am I doing here? What actually matters? What do I want to contribute before I die? The choice to do the work, the uncomfortable, unglamorous work of facing your shadow, healing your trauma, releasing your conditioning, developing your consciousness. The choice to serve, to recognize that you're not separate from the whole, that what helps the whole helps you, that your purpose is found in contribution. These are not grand gestures. These are quiet commitments. Choices made in the privacy of your own consciousness. Choices that no one else might ever know about. But they matter. They create ripples. They shift the field. And when enough individuals make these choices, when enough nodes in the network activate, the system reaches a threshold. And suddenly, the impossible becomes possible. Patterns that seemed fixed begin to shift. Structures that seemed permanent begin to dissolve. New configurations that were latent begin to manifest. The ancient prophecies speak of this moment. They call it different things. The great purification, the shift of ages, the awakening, the quickening, but they all describe the same process, a period of maximum chaos followed by a reorganization into a new order. And they all say the same thing: the outcome is not predetermined. It depends on choices made during the transition. If enough humans remain unconscious, if enough people cling to the old paradigm, if enough energy goes into maintaining what's collapsing, then the collapse will be total. The reset will be complete. The knowledge will scatter again. But if enough humans wake up, if enough people embody the new paradigm, if enough energy goes into building what's emerging, then the transition can be navigated, the knowledge can be preserved. The next world can be consciously designed rather than unconsciously inherited. The prophecies are not predictions. They're descriptions of possibilities, and which possibility manifests depends on us. So let me return to the question I asked at the beginning. The question that started this entire exploration. Where did the knowledge come from? How did the Sumerians appear fully formed, with mathematics and astronomy and writing and metallurgy already in place? Now you have the answer, multiple answers, actually depending on which framework resonates for you. The conventional answer: they developed it themselves, and we simply haven't found the earlier, simpler versions yet. The intervention answer: they were by non-human intelligence. Whether you call that aliens or angels or the APK, all you. The cyclic answer: they inherited it from survivors of the previous iteration, from people who carried fragments of knowledge through the catastrophe and taught it to the next generation. Or perhaps all three are true in different ways. Perhaps the boundaries between these explanations are less clear than we assume. But here's what matters more than which explanation is correct: the recognition that we are in the same position now that they were in then. We are inheriting a planet that has been shaped by activity we only partially understand. We are building on foundations we didn't lay. We are using knowledge we didn't originate, and we are approaching a transition point, a moment when the cycle could turn again, when what we've built could collapse, when the knowledge we've accumulated could scatter. Unless we choose differently, unless we become conscious enough to recognize the pattern and break it. The seventh world is not a place. It's not a time. It's a state of consciousness. It's the state where humanity finally integrates the lessons of the previous 6 iterations, where we stop repeating the cycle of rise and fall, where we achieve stable complexity based on wisdom rather than brittle complexity based on power. And that state becomes possible when enough individuals embody it, when enough people live from consciousness rather than conditioning, when enough nodes in the network reach a threshold of awakening. We don't know how many it takes. We don't know how close we are. We don't know if we have decades or years or months. But we know this: every person who wakes up matters. Every practice session matters. Every choice made from consciousness rather than unconsciousness matters. You matter. Your awareness contributes to the field. Your transformation affects the whole, not because you're special, because you're connected, because separation is illusion, because we're all expressions of the same underlying consciousness, and when one part wakes up, the whole benefits. So here's what I'm asking you to do. Not for me, not even for yourself, for the pattern, for the possibility that this time, the 7th iteration, we finally get it right. First, don't just watch this and move on. Don't let this be another piece of content that you consume and forget. Sit with it. Let it work on you. Notice what it activates. Notice what resistance arises. Notice what recognition occurs. Because information is useless unless it transforms. And transformation requires time, reflection, integration. Second, ask the questions. The real questions. Not the ones that can be answered with facts, but the ones that open inquiry. If this pattern is real, what does it mean for how I live my life? What does it mean for my choices, my priorities, my purpose? If we're approaching a transition, how do I want to meet it? What kind of human do I want to become? What do I want to have contributed when I look back from the end of my life? If consciousness matters, if my awareness affects the field, then what practices do I need to commit to? What work do I need to do? What transformation is being asked of me? Don't look for answers immediately. Live with the questions. Let them permeate your consciousness. Let them guide you. Third, find the others. You're not alone in this. There are millions of people worldwide who are sensing the same pattern, feeling the same call, doing the same work. They might not use the same language. They might come from different traditions, different backgrounds, different frameworks. But they're recognizing the same thing, that we're at a turning point, that consciousness matters, that transformation is both necessary and possible. Find them, connect, build networks of mutual support. Because the work of consciousness is difficult, and it's easier in community. And when you find each other, don't just share information. Share practice. Support each other's transformation. Hold each other accountable. Celebrate each other's growth. Become the mystery school. The guardians. The edge-dwellers who will preserve wisdom through the transition. Fourth, share this. But share it wisely. Don't proselytize. Don't try to convince anyone. The pattern reveals itself to those who are ready to see it. Forcing it on people who aren't ready just creates resistance. But when you meet someone who is asking the questions, who is sensing that something is shifting, who is hungry for understanding, share what you found. Point them to the evidence. Share the frameworks. Introduce them to the practices. Help them see what you've seen. Because the awakening spreads person to person, conversation by conversation, slowly at first but potentially exponentially as more people carry the transmission. You might be the link in the chain that connects someone to the work they need to do. You might be the catalyst for their transformation, which might be the catalyst for others. This is how phase transitions happen. Slowly, then suddenly, and we don't know which conversation might be the tipping point. And finally, live it. Embody it. Don't just understand the pattern intellectually. Become the pattern change. If you recognize that we are approaching a crisis, live as if the crisis is already here. Not in panic, but in preparation. Not in fear, but in wisdom. Simplify. Build resilience. Develop skills. Strengthen community. Practice consciousness. Deepen your connection to source. Not because you're certain of what's coming, no one is certain, but because living this way is valuable regardless. If the catastrophe comes, you'll be prepared. You'll be one of the guardians who can carry knowledge forward. And if the catastrophe is averted, if enough of us shift and the transition happens more gently, you'll have lived a life of meaning, purpose, and consciousness. You'll have contributed to the tipping. Either way, you win. Either way, you'll have become more fully human. There's a teaching from the Bhagavad Gita that's relevant here. Arjuna, the warrior, is standing on a battlefield facing an impossible choice. Fight and kill people he loves, or refuse and allow evil to prevail. He asks Krishna what he should do. And Krishna's answer is profound. You have the right to your actions, but not to the fruits of your actions. Do what's right. Make the choice that aligns with your deepest understanding. But release attachment to the outcome. You cannot control whether humanity completes the seventh world or collapses into another reset. That's beyond individual control. That's a collective outcome determined by billions of choices made by billions of people. But you can control your choice, your practice, your consciousness, your contribution. So do the work, make the choice, play your part. But hold the outcome lightly. Trust that consciousness has its own intelligence. That the universe is not random but organized by principles we only partially understand. That there's a wisdom operating that transcends individual understanding. The mystics call this surrender. Not giving up, but giving over. Doing everything you can and then trusting the process. The Sumerians stood where we stand now. Inheriting fragments. Trying to rebuild. Attempting to make sense of a world shaped by forces they could only partially see. And they encoded their understanding in numbers, in myths, in monuments that would last long enough for us to find them. The cosmic cycle. The turning of ages. The pattern of rise and fall. They were trying to tell us something. Across 5,000 years, across the gulf of dead languages and lost contexts, they were sending a message. This has happened before. This will happen again. Unless you learn, unless you remember, unless you break the pattern. We receive the message. We decrypt the code. We recognize the pattern. Now the question is, what will we do with it? Will we remain asleep, comfortable in the illusion that we're special, that the pattern doesn't apply to us, that we're immune to the cycles that have governed human civilization for tens of thousands of years? Or will we wake up? Will we recognize that we're part of the pattern? Will we make the choice to become the iteration that finally learns? The seventh world is not guaranteed, but it's possible. And the possibility lives in moments like this, in the choice you're making right now as you listen to these words. The choice to see or to look away, to wake up or to stay asleep, to participate or to passively observe. Every moment is the choice point. Every breath is an opportunity to choose consciousness or unconsciousness, and the accumulated weight of these choices, made by millions of people, will determine which world manifests. A world where we repeat the cycle, scatter the knowledge once again, and leave future archaeologists to puzzle over our ruins. Or a world where we transcend the cycle, integrate the lessons, and become the civilization that finally remembers. The seventh world, the completion, the awakening, it begins with you, with your choice, right now. What will you choose? Leave a comment. But don't tell me what you think. Don't tell me whether you agree or disagree. Tell me what you feel. Tell me what's arising in you. Tell me what this recognition is calling you toward. And tell me if you could leave one message for the eighth world, for the people who come after us, what would it be? Not advice, not warnings, not explanations, just the one thing you wish someone from the sixth world had told you. What is it? Think of it softly. Let the message drift into your dreams. You don't need to write it now. Just hold it in your heart as you drift away, because those messages, those collective insights, that's how the wisdom gets encoded. That's how it survives. We are the guardians now. We are the mystery school. We are the seventh world, standing at the threshold. And the choice we make in this moment echoes through eternity. The pattern is visible. The cycle is clear.